In 1993, two cargo pilots, Ray Castillo and Dennis Arroway, walked into a regional airport in the Texas Panhandle for a routine overnight shift and were never seen again. Their aircraft sat waiting on the ramp. Their flight bags were found untouched in the crew lounge. Security footage showed them entering the terminal, but no footage ever showed them leaving. For over 30 years, their families searched for answers, clinging to hope that somehow, somewhere, they were still alive. But when construction workers began breaking ground beneath an old concrete apron in 2025, they found something hidden deep under the surface. Something that would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what happened that night. This is the story of the vanishing at Terminal C. The last thing Ray Castillo remembered about his shift was the coffee, burnt, sitting too long in the break room pot at Delhart Regional, the kind of coffee that tasted like someone had made it angry on purpose. He poured it anyway, because it was 11:40 at night, and the red-eye cargo run to El Paso wasn't scheduled until 1:15 in the morning, and there was nothing else to do in a terminal that felt less like an airport and more like a waiting room for a town that had already given up. Delhart, Texas, in 1993, was the kind of place that existed mostly as a dot on a map between Amarillo and nowhere. The airport served two commercial carriers, a handful of charter operations, and a cargo logistics company called Lone Star Freight Solutions that had moved into the East Hangar 18 months earlier with very little fanfare and a lot of unmarked trucks. The terminal had 4 gates, one operating security checkpoint staffed by a single guard after 9 p.m., and a network of maintenance corridors beneath the main floor that most employees had never fully explored. The ceilings in those corridors were low. The lighting was the kind that flickered when the wind came off the panhandle hard enough, which was most nights. Ray was 31 years old, a cargo pilot with 6 years of experience and a reputation for being meticulous. His logbooks were immaculate. He filed discrepancy reports when other pilots shrugged and signed off. His supervisor at Lone Star, a compact man named Gerald Pruitt, had told him once that his attention to detail was either going to make him very successful or very difficult. And Ray had taken that as a compliment, even though it probably wasn't meant as one. His co-pilot that night was a man named Dennis Arroway, 37, originally from Corpus Christi, who had been flying cargo for most of his adult life, and who carried a worn photograph of his 2 daughters in his breast pocket, the way other men carried cigarettes. Dennis was easy company. He didn't talk much on the ground, but was communicative and calm in the air, which was the combination Ray valued most in the people he flew with. They met in the crew lounge at 11:50, checked the weather briefing together, and went over the cargo manifest for the El Paso run. 3 pallets of machine components, 1 container of agricultural supplies, declared total weight 8,400 pounds. Ray noted that the weight seemed high for the listed contents, but said nothing yet. He had noted similar discrepancies twice in the past month, and had flagged them both times to Pruitt, who had told him the manifests were correct and that Ray should focus on flying the aircraft rather than auditing the freight department. Dennis poured himself coffee, made a face at the taste, and set it down without drinking it. He looked out through the smudged window at the tarmac, where the cargo aircraft sat under the yellow wash of the ramp lights, its engines cold, the ground crew absent. The loading had been completed 2 hours earlier, which was unusual. Normally the loaders finished within the hour before departure. Someone was in a hurry tonight, Dennis said. Ray looked at the manifest again. He looked at the weight. He looked at the time the loading had been logged, and then at the name of the supervisor who had signed off on it. The name was not a name he recognized from the regular ground crew. The handwriting was neat, but not familiar. They should start the pre-flight, he said. They left the crew lounge at 11:58. The security camera mounted above the corridor entrance recorded them walking toward the door that led to the ramp access tunnel. It recorded the door opening. It did not record them coming back. 32 years later, the man who stood in the dried mud at the edge of the excavation site and read through the initial discovery report was named Daniel Voss. He was 42 years old, a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cold Case Review Unit, and he had driven from Dallas that morning with a thermos of black coffee and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has seen too many of these sites to pretend they don't affect him. The construction foreman, a sunburned man named Pete Okafor, walked him through what they had found. The runway extension project had required breaking up the old concrete apron behind what used to be the east hangar, which had been demolished in 2011. When the jackhammer crew hit the subsurface layer, they found it hollow 3 feet down. The hollow turned out to be a poured concrete room approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, accessible through a steel utility door that opened inward and that had, at some point in its existence, been sealed from the outside with a welded bracket. The bracket, Okafor said, was not on any maintenance record. The room itself was not on any schematic. He had been doing airport construction for 20 years and had never seen anything like it, meaning a structure this deliberate, this permanent, built inside an active infrastructure zone with no documentation and no apparent official purpose. Voss pulled on examination gloves and stepped down into the excavation. The room had been partially exposed. The concrete walls were intact. The floor was cracked but unbroken. In the northeast corner, still positioned against the wall as though whoever had placed them there had done so with some care, were 2 sets of human remains in what had once been flight uniforms. Between them on the floor was a flight bag, its zipper still closed. On the door, at approximately shoulder height, were deep parallel grooves in the steel, the kind made by human fingernails, pressed hard and dragged downward over a long time. Voss stood in the room for a long moment. The air was stale and close, and carried a quality he had no word for, not quite chemical and not quite organic, but something that existed in the space between. He climbed out, pulled off his gloves, and called the unit liaison to request a forensic anthropologist. The woman who arrived the following morning was named Dr. Claire Odom. She was 34 years old, based at the University of Texas in Austin, and had worked recovery analysis on 7 cold case sites in the past 3 years, 2 of which had involved similar sealed environments. She arrived with 2 graduate students, a case of equipment, and the manner of someone who had learned very early in her career to observe everything and assume nothing. She spent 4 hours in the room before she came to find Voss, who was standing outside the construction perimeter reviewing the airport's personnel records from 1993 on a laptop. The remains are consistent with 2 adult males, she said, somewhere between mid-20s and early 40s, based on skeletal development. Cause of death I'll have to confirm, but the positioning, the scatter pattern, and what I can see of the nail impressions on the door strongly suggest asphyxiation in a sealed environment. She paused. They were alive for a while after the door was sealed. Based on the distribution of the biological indicators I'm finding, I would estimate somewhere between 20 and 30 hours. Voss closed the laptop. He had heard those estimates before, in other cases, in rooms that were not supposed to exist. He had learned not to let the number land immediately, to hold it at a distance until the practical work was done. Were they conscious that whole time? He asked. She looked at him steadily. Almost certainly, yes. For most of it. He nodded. The IDs from the flight bag, he said. Those match a missing persons report from September 1993. 2 cargo pilots named Ray Castillo and Dennis Arroway. They were logged entering the terminal at Delhart Regional at 11:58 on the night of September 14th. They were reported missing the next morning when their flight failed to depart. The original investigation ran for 8 months and found nothing. Claire looked back at the excavation. They were here the whole time. That's what it looks like. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else. When I do the full analysis, I'll know more, but there is a third set of biological material in that room. Hair, some tissue residue, bone fragment that doesn't belong to either primary set of remains. Whoever else was in that room either left before the door was sealed or was removed afterward." Voss looked at her. "You're certain?" "I'm a scientist," she said. "I don't do certain until I do the analysis. But I'm telling you now, so you have time to think about what it means." The personnel files from Delhart Regional in 1993 had been stored in a county records warehouse outside Amarillo, not digitized, smelling of age and the particular staleness of paper that has been in boxes for decades without anyone caring about what it contains. Voss and Claire drove there together on the third day after the discovery, and Voss spent 6 hours reading, while Claire sat across the folding table from him and worked through the manifest photocopies that the airport's administrative archive had produced, slowly and with some resistance, after the FBI request arrived. The original investigation into the disappearance of Castillo and Arroway had been conducted by the local sheriff's department and a single FBI field agent out of Amarillo, who had been reassigned after 4 months. It had identified no suspects, no witnesses, and no physical evidence connecting any known person to the pilot's disappearance. The working theory at the time of closure had been voluntary absence, a conclusion that Voss found almost offensively insufficient, but that he recognized as the kind of conclusion you reach when pressure is applied from above to close a case that isn't going anywhere. He found the name of the cargo supervisor who had signed the September 14th manifest on page 47 of the employment file box. The name was listed as T. Harmon, temporary contractor, engaged through a labor agency called Panhandle Staffing Services. The labor agency, when Voss ran the name that afternoon through state records, had dissolved in early 1994. No forwarding address, no principals on file with the state. He found something else on page 62, a disciplinary note in Ray Castillo's employment file, dated August 1993, 6 weeks before he disappeared. The note recorded that Castillo had been formally warned after raising concerns about cargo weight discrepancies with the airport's operations director, without first clearing the concern through his direct supervisor at Lone Star Freight Solutions. The note was co-signed by the operations director, a man named Frank Dolce, and by Gerald Pruitt, Castillo's supervisor. Claire, reading the manifest copies across the table, looked up. She set down the paper she was holding. "This container here," she said, container C-22, listed as agricultural components on the September 14th manifest. Declared weight is 2,100 pounds. But look at the loading log. The actual weight recorded by the ramp scale was 3,600 pounds. The difference isn't noted anywhere. There's no amendment, no supervisor flag, no secondary check. Someone just moved on. Voss came around the table to look. They had seen a version of this before in the Morrison-Brennan case out of Nevada that Torres had briefed him on during his orientation. Weight discrepancy as a signature of something inside the container that wasn't on the list. Was C-22 on the aircraft when it was found? She shook her head. The El Paso run never departed. The aircraft sat on the ramp all night. When ground crew arrived the next morning, the cargo hold was empty. All containers had been offloaded. Who authorized the offload? She turned the page. Frank Dolce. Voss stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the flat, brown Texas landscape. Frank Dolce, operations director, had co-signed the disciplinary note against Ray Castillo for raising weight discrepancies. Frank Dolce had then authorized the removal of all cargo from an aircraft whose pilots were already missing, before anyone had officially confirmed the pilots were missing. He turned back. "Find me everything on Frank Dolce," he said. The DNA results came back on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after the initial discovery. Claire called Voss from her lab in Austin and read him the results in the flat, precise tone she used when the information was significant enough to require care. Primary remains confirmed as Raymond Luis Castillo and Dennis Michael Arroway, she said. The third biological sample, the hair and tissue fragments, she paused briefly, produced a match in the CODIS database. The profile belongs to a man named Thomas Hargrove, born 1961 in Lubbock, Texas. He has a prior arrest for fraud in 1989, charges dropped. He also has a current Texas driver's license, issued in 2019, with an address in a suburb of San Antonio. Voss sat down. Thomas Hargrove is alive, as of the license renewal, yes. And his DNA is in that room. She was quiet for a moment. Yes. Voss called the San Antonio field office that afternoon and asked them to conduct a preliminary locate on Hargrove without contact. By the following morning, they confirmed he was living under the name Thomas Hale, had been using the name since at least 2001, and was employed at a small logistics company that operated out of San Antonio International. Logistics, Voss said to the field agent on the phone. The agent confirmed it. Voss flew to San Antonio the next day. He did not bring backup. He sat in a rental car across from the logistics company for 2 hours before Hargrove, now Hale, came out for lunch. The man was 63 years old, heavy-set, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose joints had accumulated decades of physical work. He had the face of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time. Voss got out of the car and crossed the street. Hargrove stopped when he saw the badge. He did not run. He did not speak. He just looked at Voss with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite resignation, but something suspended between them. "You were in that room," Voss said. Hargrove looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I got out." "How?" "The welded bracket on the outside," Hargrove said. "It wasn't welded when they first closed it. They used a padlock. Someone was supposed to come back and weld it later. I found the edge of the door frame in the dark. I had a pocket knife. It took me most of the night to work the hinge pin loose enough to get the door to flex. I got out maybe 4 hours before sunrise. Castillo and Arroway. They were still alive when I left. They told me to go. They said someone had to get out and tell someone what happened." Voss watched him. "Why didn't you?" Hargrove's face did not change. "Because the man who put us in that room was Frank Dolce. And Frank Dolce had, by the time I got out of that building and found a payphone, already called 2 of the men who worked for him and told them I was loose. I drove to Oklahoma that night. I kept driving." "You let them die." "I was 21 years old," Hargrove said. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it that had been living in him for 3 decades. "I have thought about it every single day since September 15th, 1993. Frank Dolce had retired from aviation in 2007 and was living outside Houston on a property that had a gate and a security camera at the entrance, and the general appearance of a man who had been comfortable for a long time and intended to stay that way. He was 71 now. He had a son who was a county judge in Harris County, and a daughter who worked in the Texas state legislature. He had contributed to 6 consecutive gubernatorial campaigns. He was not the kind of man who expected a federal investigator to show up at his gate on a Wednesday afternoon with a case file, a warrant, and the expression of someone who had not slept in 3 days. The interview lasted 4 hours. Dolce had a lawyer present within the first 20 minutes. Voss did not care. He had Hargrove's recorded statement. He had the DNA evidence. He had the cargo manifests. And he had something Dolce did not know about yet. A second set of manifests that Claire had located in a decommissioned storage unit belonging to the estate of Gerald Pruitt, who had died in 2018, which documented 18 months of irregular cargo operations through Delhart Regional between 1992 and 1994, each one listing weight discrepancies, and each one bearing Dolce's signature. Lone Star Freight Solutions, Voss told him, had been a logistics front for a network that used regional cargo aircraft to move people across the southern interior of the country. Not always, and not only people. But the containers with the wrong weights, the late-night loading operations, the supervisors who weren't on the regular payroll, all of it pointed to a system that had been running through Delhart with the knowledge and participation of the airport's operations director. Ray Castillo had figured it out. He had documented it, and he had told Dennis Arroway. What Voss had not expected, and what Claire had found in the detailed examination of the flight bag contents recovered from the sealed room, was a folded note in Castillo's handwriting that read like the final entry of a man who had understood exactly what was happening to him. The note named Dolce. It named Pruitt. It named a third person, referred to only as the contact in Dallas, whose identity Voss had not yet confirmed. It also contained 3 sentences that Voss had read 12 times, and that he had not yet shown to anyone outside the investigation. Castillo had written, "I knew about the container weights before August. I said nothing for 2 months because Pruitt told me the operation had federal oversight, and I believed him. I should not have believed him. By the time I understood what I was actually part of, it was too late to separate myself cleanly from it." Claire had read the note when Voss showed it to her in the hotel room in Houston the night before the Dolce interview. She had sat with it for a long time. "He was involved," she said. "He thought he was involved in something sanctioned," Voss said. "And then he found out what it actually was. And he started keeping records." She handed the note back. "That doesn't make him a victim in the straightforward sense." "No," Voss said, "it doesn't." The federal case against Frank Dolce was filed in the Southern District of Texas 11 weeks after the Delhart discovery. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and involvement in a criminal enterprise related to illegal transport of persons across state lines. Thomas Hargrove, now legally restored to his original name, entered a cooperation agreement. He was not charged. Voss had argued against charging him, and the U.S. Attorney had agreed with limited enthusiasm. The contact in Dallas was identified 6 weeks into the prosecution preparation as a man named Robert Cale, who had served 2 terms in the Texas state legislature in the 1990s, and who was, as of 2025, the chairman of a private infrastructure investment firm, with contracts across 11 states, including 3 airport development projects. He was 77 years old. His lawyers were better than Dolce's lawyers. The case against him was built slowly and carefully, and Voss was told by the prosecutor handling it that going after Cale would require patience, and that patience in federal prosecution was measured in years. Dennis Arroway's daughters, who were in their early 40s now, had been notified. They had grown up without a father and without knowing why, and when the investigator from the Victim Notification Unit called them, the older one had simply said, "I knew he wouldn't have left us." That was all she said. The families of people identified as possible trafficking victims through the Lone Star Manifest records. 18 families so far, and the number was expected to grow, were being contacted by a separate team. Some of those victims had been found years ago, under circumstances that had never been properly explained. Some were still missing. Some had probably been missing for so long that there was no family left to notify. Voss drove back to Delhart on a Thursday in November 2025, the week before the first pretrial hearing in the Dolce case. He did not have a reason to go that he could have easily explained to a supervisor. He stood at the edge of the filled excavation site in the cold wind that came off the panhandle, with nothing to stop it, and he looked at the flat gray concrete that now covered the room where Ray Castillo and Dennis Arroway had spent their last hours. Claire had driven up from Austin to meet him. She stood beside him with her hands in her coat pockets and said nothing for a while. "Castillo's note," she said finally. "The part about knowing and staying quiet. What do you do with that?" Voss looked at the concrete. "I put it in the file as written," he said. "The record reflects what he wrote. The record also reflects what he did after he understood. He documented everything," he told Arroway. "He tried." "But it doesn't go away," she said. "No," Voss said. "It doesn't go away." The pretrial hearing produced a motion from Dolce's defense team to suppress the manifest evidence on chain of custody grounds. The motion was pending. Robert Cale's lawyers had filed a preemptive civil suit against the FBI, alleging improper investigation procedures. It was widely understood in the U.S. Attorney's Office that Cale had connections that extended into the current administration, not any specific administration, just the kind of connection that powerful men accumulate over decades of carefully placed money and carefully maintained relationships. The case would move forward. Voss believed that. He had built it carefully, with Claire's analysis and Hargrove's testimony, and 32 years of documentary evidence that Ray Castillo had created in the weeks before he died. The evidence existed. The record was clear. But the week after Voss returned to Dallas, 3 boxes of original cargo documentation that had been held in the Delhart County Records warehouse went missing. The warehouse manager reported a break-in. Nothing else was taken. The county sheriff's report noted no suspects identified. Voss had copies of everything. He had digitized the relevant documents on the second day of the investigation, before anyone outside the construction crew knew what had been found beneath the apron. He had done it out of habit, out of the particular caution of a man who had learned years earlier, on a different case involving different people who also disappeared into systems that didn't account for them, that evidence left alone in the dark had a way of disappearing. He filed a report about the missing documents and continued building the case. In San Antonio, Thomas Hargrove sat in the house he had lived in, under a name that was not his own, for 26 years. And he thought about 2 men in the dark who had told a 21-year-old kid to go, who had made a decision in a sealed room that someone had to carry the knowledge out, even if the rest of them couldn't follow. He thought about what they had known about him in that moment, that he would run, that he would stay silent, that 32 years would pass before anyone came to the door. He had been right to run. He had been wrong to stay silent. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and he had lived inside that contradiction for so long that it had become indistinguishable from the shape of his life. In Houston, Frank Dolce met with his lawyers every Tuesday and said nothing publicly, and waited for the system he had operated inside for 30 years to find him a way out. The way it always had, the way it was designed to, for people who understood how to use it. And in a suburb of Austin, in an office that smelled of bone dust and old paper, Claire Odom drafted her formal forensic report on the Delhart remains and wrote, in the section reserved for observations, that the evidence of survival time within the sealed structure, combined with the physical marks on the interior door, indicated a sustained and conscious effort to escape that continued until the capacity for effort was exhausted. She wrote it in the precise, neutral language of forensic science, and then she sat for a moment before she continued, because some facts required a moment before they could be filed and set aside and moved past. The report went into the case record. The case record was filed. The pre-trial hearings continued. Somewhere in the infrastructure of a country that was built in part on systems like the one that had run through Delhart Regional Airport in 1993. The same systems, with different names, continued to operate, because the infrastructure that allowed them was not a single man, or a single operation, or a single sealed room. It was the accumulation of decisions made by people who understood that the easiest thing a powerful institution can do with an inconvenient truth is give it a file number and wait. Voss knew this. He had known it for years. He continued anyway. Not because he believed it would be enough, because it was the only honest response to a world where two men had scratched at a steel door in the dark, and someone needed to acknowledge, formally and on the record, that they had been there. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Ray Castillo's note, or the scratch marks on that steel door, or the 26 years Thomas Hargrove spent living under a name that wasn't his, then you already understand why cases like this one cannot be allowed to disappear a second time. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, because the next case we cover is already waiting, and it begins the same way this one did, with a routine night, a door that opened, and a question that took decades to answer. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think happened to Robert Cale. Tell us whether you believe Thomas Hargrove deserved his immunity. Tell us whether Ray Castillo was a victim, a collaborator, or something the language of justice doesn't have a clean word for yet. The conversation matters. The cases that don't get discussed are the cases that stay buried. And we have been covering buried cases long enough to know that the ones people talk about are the ones that finally, sometimes, get answered.